And now back. And now back to the Jennifer Fulwiler Show from Austin, Texas.
Weiler, so delighted to have you joining me here this afternoon. Come say hello at thejffshow.com. I would absolutely love to hear from you, and I'm so excited to talk to my guest for this segment. Like I said, I found him when I read this article about communication tips from a former hostage negotiator, and I told Jackie, I said, we've got to get him on the show. I would love to hear more of his insights on this subject. His name is Gary Noesner. He has got a great book called Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI hostage negotiator. He retired from the FBI in 2003 following a 30-year career as an investigator, instructor, and negotiator. A significant focus of his career was directed toward investigating Middle East hijackings in which American citizens were victimized. He's been involved in suicide incidents, prison riots, right-wing militia standoffs, and kidnappings. I mean, he has a fascinating background, and I can't wait to chat with him. Gary, welcome to the Jennifer Fulwiler Show.
Well, thanks, Jennifer. It's a pleasure to be here with you today.
Yeah, so Gary, I guess my first question would be, did you grow up wanting to be a hostage negotiator, or how do you end up in this line of work?
Well, a little serendipitous, I guess. There was no such thing when I was growing up. The field of negotiation started really in the early 70s by the New York City Police Department when they realized that the previous method of trying to demand surrender and then going in to forcibly arrest people and resulting in the use of deadly force, perpetrators dying, hostages, police officers, that they had to do something better. And they came up with this idea. They shared it with the FBI, and the FBI expanded the concept and began to teach it all over the United States and the world. So I joined the FBI in 1972, and shortly after I joined, I learned about this new emerging field, and something about it really attracted me. I'd wanted to be an FBI agent since I was a kid, but obviously I didn't know then that negotiations would end up being my specialty for certainly the second half of my career.
Oh, that's fascinating. And again, I'm so glad you laid out the story of your career in Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. So when you first started doing this, the first few kind of high stakes situations that you got involved in, I mean, were you terrified of, being in these first few situations? The book opens with one involving a guy named Charlie who had taken his common law wife hostage and was threatening to kill her. I mean, were you terrified when you first began doing this? Because obviously there's so much at stake in these kinds of situations.
Yeah, not to sound too self-serving, but I think terrified might be too strong a word. I mean, you always have some apprehension, but I was always very confident in my skills. And I think the thing I've always tried to teach negotiators through the years is that you have to go into a situation realizing that your ability to dictate the outcome is limited. We are influencers, and so we try to turn people away from violence. We try to persuade them to be cooperative, and we are successful in a very high percentage of the incidents that we respond to. But you also have to be realistic enough to note that you don't have absolute control over the behavior of another. And suicide is one of those areas. If somebody really wants to kill themselves, it can be quite a challenge to convince them not to. And if they do it, it's not a failure of negotiations. It's just a testimony to that person's resolve that probably no one was going to be able to change. So Rudyard Kipling has this wonderful quote. I used the partial quote in one of my book chapter titles, and it's, if you can keep your head about you when all else lose theirs. So negotiators feel emotion, they feel stress, but good ones have learned to kind of compartmentalize it and put it aside and focus at the often very challenging and difficult task at hand.
And Gary Noesner, that's one of the reasons that I think listeners of this particular show will love your book, Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator, because, a lot of us, we have a lot of parents listening to the show. We talk a lot about just some of the difficulties of parenting when, your kid goes off and he might be living just this totally different life that is, not in line with the values that you were hoping that he would live by. And Gary, I hear from a lot of stressed parents who say, oh gosh, we've got Thanksgiving coming up, or maybe it's not a kid, maybe it's a brother, sister, other family member, and they tend to get really stressed about how these interactions are going to go. And listening to you talk, I think that's an interesting insight about when you perceive that you even have the control to completely change the outcome. Like it's all up to me. The weight of the world is on my shoulders and I can and have to do this. That is a very, very high stress situation. I think that's an interesting angle that you took on it, saying where you said you have to go into a situation realizing that your ability to affect the outcome is limited. And I can see how that actually makes you a better communicator, a better negotiator, when you don't feel the weight of the world on your shoulders. And you just look at it like, I'm here. I think that I have the skills to have maximum impact, but it's not all up to me. There's some things that are beyond my control. Is that an important part of the mentality?
Well, I think so. And police officers face it all the time. We've all seen on the news where someone is on a bridge or an overpass and threatening suicide, and the police officers are, some 20 feet away, maybe closer, and trying to talk that person down. And I think if you put the weight of the world on your shoulders and say that if this person jumps, it is my failure, then I think you do yourself a disservice. I think you have to say, here's a troubled individual, and I can't, in this short time, fully know everything that's gone on in their life and in their world and what's on their mind, but I'm going to try to influence them positively. But at the end of the day, it's their decision. The only aspect that we can fully control as a negotiator or someone dealing with a stressful situation is your own emotion. That's the only thing you have absolute, complete control over, and that's actually the very first thing we tell negotiators. Self-control is really the key. And if you can control your own emotions and not let them dictate your behavior to making bad decisions or saying things that are regrettable or unfortunate, you stand a far improved chance of having the outcome that you want. And certainly holidays are stressful. I mean, no one alive has not encountered, family turmoil and struggle. And I think people have to realize that you just can't always get your way. You can't always get people to think and behave the way that you ideally want them to. What you can try to do is model your own appropriate behavior and be encouraging and supportive and listen to their point of view. It's interesting. As a parent, I always found, and I think this is absolutely true, we as fathers particularly want to lecture our children and our sons and pass on all this information. And you know the story. After 5 minutes, their eyes glaze over and,
Right.
and so forth and so on. But where your children learn from you is by watching and observing how you treat the waiter or waitress in a restaurant, how you interact with some stranger on the street, or some lady trips on the sidewalk, how you rush to help her up. These are the things that have an indelible mark on our children and really make the difference. So living the life as you'd like your children to live it is really the most powerful influence you can have on them, rather than say, sit down, I'm going to tell you about life in 30 minutes and remember all of this and apply it as you will, So, I think we have to really kind of understand our limitations and be thoughtful. The best way to communicate is be a good listener.
Yes. And honestly, that is hard to do, especially in high stakes situations, whether it's the type of seriously high stakes where it's a kidnapping, it's a hostage standoff. But I think even as parents, sometimes it feels very high stakes. If you have a kid who is, maybe they've gotten involved in drugs, maybe something is, they are on a path that is really putting their future and maybe even their life at risk. It is hard to be a good listener when you feel like there's a lot on the line. Because I know myself, I immediately go into lecture mode. You've got to get off that track. This is going to mess up your future. I mean, how do you summon the self-control to be quiet and be a good listener?
Business guru Stephen Covey says it. He says, first listen, then be understood. So to really change someone's behavior, to have an influence on how they act, we have to have that word, influence. We have to be able to exercise some input into what their decision-making process. You have to earn the right to do that. You don't just do it because of your status, even as a parent or as a friend or a law enforcement officer or a minister, whatever it might be. I think you have to show through this communication dialogue that you're willing to listen to them, to understand their point of view. You acknowledge their points. It doesn't mean you have to agree or disagree with them. Just listen to them. People want to be heard. They want to be understood. They want to be appreciated. And when you do that in a genuine way, and you don't just nod your head passively, we call it active listening skills in the business, because active in that your responses, your open-ended questions, your follow-up, your summary of what they say, your paraphrasing, you're identifying the emotions you hear in their voice. You're really angry with that, Jennifer. I can tell you're really mad at me for what I did or said yesterday. I'm not agreeing with you. I'm just saying I understand your feelings. And when I state it, I'm proving it. I'm demonstrating it. So once we establish that, it really kind of takes the wind out of the sails of someone's anger and frustration. And then we get to a point where eventually now they may turn back and ask us the questions. Well, I just don't know what to do, and maybe that's now the invitation for you to say, well, have you ever thought about this or that? So it just takes some patience. It's sort of a roundabout way to get where we want. We have a tendency as Americans to, certainly those of us in law enforcement and military experiences, we want to identify a problem, solve the problem, and move on to the next problem. When in reality, we have to kind of slow down, and the only way problems are really solved if you help that person understand how they need to take ownership of it and resolve it, and that's through listening.
That is such a great insight. And I really encourage people to get more of these kind of insights in your book, Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. They can also find out more about you, Gary, at GaryNoesner.com. And that's Noesner, GaryNoesner.com. And I love in this article I read where I first discovered you, you say, only when the hostage taker feels heard and understood can you begin to establish a relationship of trust. And so that is kind of the goal here, right? Whether you're at the difficult family dinner where you're trying to get your kid to, hear your point of view, or you're in a serious hostage situation, would you say that's the overarching goal? Establish a relationship of trust with this person?
Yeah, you go back to one of the greatest programs of all time, the Andy Griffin Show, and Opie would have some little crisis of the week, and what did Andy do? He very rarely just said, this is what you need to do. He didn't dictate to him like we so often would expect some fathers to really lay down the law, and he listened to him, and he talked to him, and he said, well, he helped him solve the problem himself, and that was a far greater gift. And I think it's a good example of how we need to do it. You have to fight that urge to say, and frankly, we know that as hostage negotiators. We come into a situation, and for example, a guy's holding his boss, and he's going to kill him because the boss fired him. I can go in and say, listen, Mr. Smith, if you kill your boss, you're not going to get your job back. And that makes sense. And of course it's true. But that person doesn't want to hear that from me right then. I have to first explore what made him come in there, what was the spark that set this off, what were his feelings of being betrayed or belittled or unappreciated at work, and how this is going to affect his family and his own career forward, his future retirement, all these things. You have to let the person kind of purge this stuff out of his system. And once they really come to a point where they say, this person understands me, then it really removes the reason for them to continue to be demonstrative and vent their spleen. And that's what really leads to solutions. But it's a process. It takes time.
Yeah, it's and one of the things that I wanted to mention that's related to that is after I read that article where you were laying out your insights that people can also get in the book Stalling for Time, that you talk about you describe you said in the industry you use a training diagram that looks like a child's teeter-totter. On one side you have emotions, and on the other side you have rational thinking. And this is a powerful image, this teeter-totter image. So we have emotions on one side, rational thinking on the other, and as one goes down, the other goes up. And so,
I've always thought I could teach a 2-week school with that one slide. It is so universally true about human behavior, and all humans have periods of emotionality and volatility and anger and frustration, all that sort of thing. Yes, and it's absolutely true. When the teeter-totter emotional side is up high, conversely, rational thinking behavior is low. And only when we first lower that emotional side of the teeter-totter can we then get the person to start thinking, behaving rationally. Because as you see, when the emotion comes down, rational thought and behavior increases. And that can take a little bit of time, and it's most effectively undertaken through the listening skills that I briefly talked about.
Yeah, and so what I thought was great about that is shortly after I read that article where you laid out these insights of what you learned in your many years as a hostage negotiator, what we can all learn from communication, I had that diagram in my mind, the teeter-totter of emotions on one side, rational thinking on the other. And we had kind of a blow up at my house with one of the kids was very, very upset about something. We're heading into the teen years, so you know how it goes. It's sometimes those kind of things, they get crazy. And so this child who was very upset was just like talking crazy talk. And some of it was, frankly, it was offensive to me. It was wrong. It was just not true what this child was saying. So based on the insights that I got from your article, I thought, okay, I need to just let him vent. Like you said, just vent the spleen, like just let it out. And before I had gotten your insights, Gary, I would have started arguing immediately. Like, that's not true. When have I ever said that? That's so disrespectful that you would make that claim. And instead, I just let this child talk and talk and talk. And I mean, it took like an hour of this child venting. And then when I used your tips of just saying, I have heard you, so it sounds like what you're saying is X, Y, Z. I wasn't saying I agreed with it. I was just saying, I hear you. Then we could have a productive conversation. And honestly, if I hadn't heard your insights, I don't know where that situation would have ended because it was getting really out of control really quickly.
I think your listeners can remember two things, and that's a great example that you used. You listen attentively, but again, actively, because you're saying things like, okay, so it sounds like you're really mad at me because I did so-and-so or such and such. And when I did that, it caused you to feel as though I didn't appreciate you or I took you for granted. And when you've really artfully identified the underlying feelings and you've sort of hit a home run in understanding, that person will acknowledge it typically. And I don't know if your child did that and said, well, yes, that's right. That's how I felt. Then it fulfills an important need that they have, and a need that has to be achieved before you can move into the more concrete problem solving. So now that we've gotten this out, where do we go from here kind of thing?
Yep. And you know what's interesting is that the child who I was having this situation with was surprised. I think because I had changed my technique, he was expecting me to immediately be defensive. And that's another thing I'm learning. I mean, this is not a place for being defensive. When you are in a high emotion, high stakes situation, you have to just let it go. Don't defend yourself. Just let this person say what they need to say. And when all I did was listen, and again, this was over an hour, Gary, of this child just really venting about everything that was on their mind. And in my mind, I'm thinking, I just don't think that's true. Oh, that's unfair. I never did that. That's a false accusation. But when I didn't defend myself and I just repeated back what he had said, his reaction was surprise. He did not expect to be listened to. And in that moment of surprise, that gave us an entryway to start to have a real productive dialogue. That opened that moment of trust, like you talk about, again, in this article and in your book, that established that trust so that we could finally transition from him venting to us working together to find a mutually beneficial situation. And I mean, did you see that in some of the many hostage negotiation situations, that surprise?
Typically in law enforcement, whether you're dealing with a prison riot or a skyjacking or right-wing malicious standoff, whatever, there's anger and there's a lot of pent-up emotion that has driven people to behave the way they are. And you're simply showing up and calling them names or saying you're idiots and we're going to win eventually. That's really not going to get to you to your goal. So you have to listen to them. Say, I want to understand how you view this and what your thoughts are. And you said you're very mad at the government. Okay, can you tell me what it is specifically that you're angry at? And I can hear the frustration in your voice. And another thing is we call it emotion labeling. When you do something like that, and Jennifer, and you say, say to your child, I can really hear that you're angry, and your child might correct you by saying, no, I'm just confused. Well, you've learned something, haven't you? Because you picked up on anger, and maybe that was part of it, but maybe not. But the fact that they've fine-tuned it a bit by saying, no, it's just confusion I have because it's not consistent with something that happened before. Well, that's helpful. Now you've really gotten some insights into the feelings that are motivating their behavior. So these are really, really good techniques, and they don't and should not be phony. It just requires patience and understanding and controlling your own emotion. You can have a tremendous impact not only on your children, but your family members, your neighbors, relatives, coworkers, you name it. If it works when somebody's holding a gun, I guarantee it'll work in a less volatile situation.
Oh, I love that. So, Gary Noesner, I think your insights are so powerful for anyone to learn from, especially as we have both this combination of the election and then the holidays. And I know a lot of us we're gonna have some tense moments at the family Thanksgiving table, at the Christmas table. So I really encourage everyone to get these insights in your book, Stalling for Time: My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator. Look you up at GaryNoesner.com, and that's Noesner. And a final question, Gary. Another thing I was thinking as I've been trying to apply your insights in my own life is this issue of time. I know that in this day and age, we all feel so rushed all the time, and especially when we get into high stress discussions. For example, the situation with one of my children, I remember thinking at the time, like, well, hey, I've got a writing deadline. Like, I don't have time to go to listen to this person vent for an hour. Like, I've got things I need to do. I've got to reply to that email. And I was tempted, Gary, to just jump in, tell this person they were wrong, and try to shut the whole thing down forcefully because I felt like I just didn't want to take the time for this. And how important is that when you're in these high-stakes situations, whether it's hostage negotiation or, again, family negotiation over the Thanksgiving dinner table, how important is it not to feel a sense of being rushed?
Well, I think it's very tough, and I think it's one of the ultimate challenges. In the medical profession, they say first do no harm. Well, in a volatile communication and a negotiation, if you do nothing else, stall for time, which is the name of my book.
That's right.
That's the reason for it. Time heals wounds. Time slows things down and allows us to better understand the position of the other person, allows us to try to get through that emotional end of the teeter-totter to where we can talk more rationally. But I think you have to set the time aside. When I ran the crisis negotiation unit in the FBI, I had about 20 people that worked for me, and occasionally someone would have an issue, and it would always come at a bad time where I had something terribly important going on. So, but I would have to bring them in my office, shut the door, put my phone on hold, come around my desk, sit next to them, and expend 20, 30, 40 minutes listening to the issue or concern that they had. And I found, oddly enough, that most of the time it really didn't result in a problem that required a firm decision from me. What it really was all about was listening to their sense of having been misunderstood, underappreciated, not given a particular assignment that they wanted, whatever it might be. If people know you're open to hearing how they feel about a situation, that's far more important than you're changing the outcome. And I think that's important. So parents, we just have to, the greatest song I ever heard in my life is Cats in the Cradle by Harry Chapin. And you know the song, Jennifer, and his little boy wants to play, and the father keeps saying, later, son, later, I'm busy. And then later when he's an old man, he wants to see his son and says, sorry, Dad, I'm too busy. And he said, my son was just like me. So you have to find the time, and you have to sit down, particularly with family members. These are the most important people in your life. And you have to say, hey, whatever else, this football game or the turkey can wait a little bit to be carved or whatever it might be, you've got to take the time and listen to these people you care about. And that will pay dividends that, can't even be, you can't say enough about.
Yeah, and Gary, what did you just say there? I wanted to write it down and I missed it. Did you say something about listening or connecting is more important than controlling the exact outcome of the situation? It's not your decision that counts. It's your genuineness and your interest.
here's something else to think about. Every time someone would surrender in a situation I was involved in, and they usually did, in the high 90 percentiles, I would ask them, what is it that I or the other negotiator said that made you come out? What was the key thing? And the answer was always the same. And you'll be surprised, and it's insightful. They always said, I don't remember what you said, but I like the way you said it. Now think about that. That is heavy stuff. So being likable and genuine and demonstrating an interest in others is far more important than your ability to come up with a brilliant solution to their problem. And it's something you have to consciously think about. Most of us do. Particularly for, I think, a lot of men who come from rigid backgrounds. We just want to jump right in and say, well, here's what you do. Here's who you got to see. Here's what you have to do. Here's how you fix this problem. And it's a generational thing with fathers, I think, more than moms. I think moms tend to be, they have to be better listeners in the traditional roles. But I, not to suggest that some fathers aren't great listeners too. But I think you get my point. And I think we all have to take the time to say, I do it when I travel as a consultant. I try to meet new people, and I say, I really want to see what I can learn about this person. I'm going to ask them questions and really find out what's important to them, what's interesting to them, and I'm going to learn as much as I can in this short amount of time. And it's amazing what you learn about people that ultimately is extraordinarily interesting.
Oh, I love it. Well, Gary Noesner, I could talk to you all day. This is absolutely fascinating. I am up against a break, so we are about out of time. But again, I really want to encourage people to get your book, Stalling for Time, My Life as an FBI Hostage Negotiator, to look you up at GaryNoesner.com, and that's Noesner. And Gary, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation, and thank you so much for joining us here on the Jennifer Fulwiler Show today.
Well, it was my pleasure, Jennifer, and thank you very much for your kind words, and I hope your listeners enjoyed the program today, and glad to help you anytime I can.
Awesome. Well, we'd love to chat with you again, and keep up the great work, Gary. And I've got to get to a quick break, and I will be back after this here on the Jennifer Fulwiler Show.